Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm very glad to see all of you here at this event sponsored by the Center for Ideas in Society at UCR. I'll get us started since we're actually a few minutes past 3:30, and we'll let anyone else who joins us just jump in as they arrive. So I'll introduce Professor McDonagh, and then she'll give her talk, and then we'll have time for questions. So I first met Professor Josephine McDonagh, who was then at Oxford University in 2006 at a conference on the verbal and the visual in 19th century culture at Birkbeck, University of London. As an assistant professor, I was a bit starstruck as I was presenting on Thomas de Quincey, and she had written a brilliant monograph, De Quincey's Disciplines, from Clarendon Press, 1994, after which it felt that there was little more to say, not to mention an important book on George Eliot from Northcote House Press and the British Council in 1997, and a strikingly original monograph, Child Murder in British Culture, 1720 to 1900, published by Cambridge in 2003. Our professional acquaintance was renewed again in 2015 when she and her colleagues who ran the Shows of London working group at King's College hosted me for a pre-circulated paper. And by this point, literature in a time of migration was well underway and had generated crucial articles in books and journals. In 2017, on the cusp of her move to the University of Chicago, she was kind enough to meet me at the British Library to talk about migration and logistics. And so all of this is to say that her brilliant and varied scholarship is entwined with her generosity as an interlocutor, so that it is an honor today to host her at the Center for Ideas in Society at UCR and to engage literature in a time of migration. Once again, with the feeling of being starstruck at its insight and timeliness, but now with the great pleasure of briefly describing that admiration to you. To write a literary and cultural history of a topic so large and of such profound critical stakes requires a kind of scholarly vision that to me seems rare in these times of small research niches, safer critical plays, and shorter books. Literature in a time of migration realizes its large scope and its convincing argument that the 19th century British novel is neither straightforwardly provincial, as the work of Raymond Williams implied, nor oblivious to its imperial political economies, as Edward Said argued. Rather, its formal, generic, and mediumistic properties are shaped by the myriad migrations of the British people throughout the world. Because Professor McDonagh's scholarship speaks explicitly to our long, violent, contemporary moment of migration, she frames it through discourses of settler colonialism, racialization, indigeneity, and penal transportation. She transforms our understanding of the 19th century novel by turning John Galt from a regional Scottish novelist to one whose Canadian short stories enact the violence of settler colonization upon Indigenous peoples, and by reintroducing us to Charlotte Bronte as a young writer of colonial African fantasies. Even Charles Dickens's Bleak House becomes something much richer than its reputation as a postmodern novel avant Lillette or an experiment in form has ever comprehended. It is rather a novel concerned with unsettlement, the new anxiety that mobility might just be a modern national characteristic. And in the chapter on Daniel Deronda, included in our reading for today, George Eliot is no longer the sociological novelist of the Midlands whose domestic dramas play out in St. Ogg's or Middlemarch, but a fierce critic of racist Anglo-Saxon imperialism who sees in Jewish migration not the seeds of Zionism, but rather, quote, settlement in transit, detached from territory on land, end quote. So these large interpretations are grounded, as always in Professor McDonagh's work, in an innovative archive, a masterly command of a vast secondary literature, and in virtuoso close readings. I believe literature in a time of migration will remain a foundational text, not only in global 19th century studies, but in literature in English more generally. Not only will modernists and postmodernists have to contend with its arguments reshaping of their assumptions, it will stand as an exemplary method for analysis that moves between print culture, literary form, and global historical events. So I could go on extolling the virtues of this book, but I'm sure you're eager to explore it with the author herself. So without more prologue, please join me in welcoming Professor Jo McDonagh.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for an incredibly generous introduction. But I love the way that you conceptualize the what I'm or describe what I'm trying to do in the book, and I'm grateful for you because it makes me feel that you've kind of grasped what it is that I'm trying to do in the book and put it very nicely. What I'm going to do, I know that you've read the introduction and chapter 7, or some of those 2 chapters. I'm going to talk about the book in a fairly introductory way for about half an hour, I think. That's okay, isn't it, Susan? Yeah, and I have a PowerPoint actually, so shall I share my screen? Am I able to do that?
You should be able to share screen as co-host.
Okay. There you go. Can you, is that, oops. Now there we go. Okay, so that's the cover of the book, and I'll talk about that a little bit as I go along, the image that I chose. So thank you very much for inviting me. The book, as the title explains, is about, and as Susan has already explained, is about British fiction, mainly the novel in the 19th century, an extraordinarily rich period in the history of the novel. But it's also a book about moving, about the movement of people, mainly but not exclusively from Britain, and mainly but not exclusively to British colonies. This phase of emigration of Britons was part of a much larger redistribution of people on a global scale that happened during the 19th century. All around the world, people were moving in larger numbers and longer distances than ever before, not just from Europe to other continents. As Lisa Lowe explains, Atlantic slavery, the indenture of Chinese and South Asian labourers, the expropriation of New World native peoples, the transportation of convicts, and the free emigration of millions of Europeans to new settlements abroad. All these movements are interlinked and wrapped in a kind of intimacy, to use her term, to worldwide processes in the history of capitalism. The period I'm interested in was a particularly important phase in the history of British colonialism, shaped by settler emigration. James Bellick refers to it problematically as the settler revolution, the settlement on a massive scale of what came to be known as the White Dominions, or the notably Anglo world, North America, South Africa, and Australasia. In emigration history, a distinction is made between spontaneous and non-spontaneous emigration. That's to say, migration that's conducted independently by individuals and families, and that which is part of organised schemes, some state-sponsored, and usually to British colonies. In this period, many more Britons moved spontaneously and in largest numbers to USA. Yet in Britain, the national conversation about migration was disproportionately fixated on the latter. I point this out to explain that migration in this period was a subject with at least 2 different faces. On the one hand, an on-the-ground redistribution of world population, and on the other hand, a topic of ideologically invested debate, in whichever way one looks, though the impact of migration was massive. For better or for worse, the world was truly remade by these demographic ruptures. I choose to call this the time of migration as opposed to the age of migration or the era of migration, both of which would have been more Victorian formulations, I think. But I wanted to avoid precisely a kind of Victorian monumentalizing. The time of migration, to my mind, signals a more ethnographic sense of migration, the experience or even the phenomenology of moving. I wanted to think about the ways that the practices of migration shaped entire ways of life, and one with many different layers, not all of which would be in accord with each other. At the back of my mind was the title of a novel by the Sudanese writer Tayeb Salih, his bracing anti-colonial work, Season of Migration to the North, that was published in 1966. That for me captures the complexity around the issue of migration and its temporalities in the aftermath of European colonialism. In the novel, we see the magnetic pull that the central character experiences in relation to Europe. This is one particular cataclysmic migration to the north, his journey to Britain. But the season of migration might then be this post-colonial aftermath in which the period of colonialism is seen as a break or a rupture that can't be repaired, only repeated. But in the novel, other kinds of migration are evoked as well, and these knit together, forming a complex texture of movement of variable speeds, cycles and distances, the seasonal flights of birds and animals, the journeys of the Sudanese officials between village and city, the movement of nomadic tribes in the desert. Salih describes a culture in which all its many strands are highly mobile, but in which these many moving parts somehow bind together to create the fragile ecosystem of the post-colony. Then, as in the colonial period, as now, there are many different ways of moving and many different seasons of migration. It raised for me the possibility that the novel as a form might facilitate a more complex apprehension of this than any other genre. So I became interested in migration in relation to the 19th century English novel because, perversely, as a topic or even as an event represented in fiction, it seemed almost not to be there. There are no great English novels about migration, I think, but I think Daniel Deronda is actually, but that's a slightly odd and oblique take on migration. The English novel in this period of its development seemed to be peculiarly inward-looking, a provincial form, interested in maintaining local attachments and protecting national boundaries. This was the reputation of the 19th century novel when I first started working on this project about 1 million years ago. Since then, there have been some very good studies that make an opposite case, but at that moment, the emphasis in criticism was on the novel as a genre that aspired to keep people in. If characters roamed overseas, it brought them back. It was a kind of imaginative repatriation service that delivered people in mind and in heart, if not also in their bodies, to something like a village community at the end of the narrative. The dominant story about the novel that was told by critics too was about nations. Even post-colonial critics, among whom Edward Said and Patrick Brantlinger were incredibly influential at that moment, they who saw the novel as a colonial project read it as a genre that liked to keep empire at arm's length. Empire, as represented in fiction, was a domain controlled from a distance, Svengali-like, from a metropolitan imperial power base, or else it was glimpsed casually in the cracks of the novel, like symptoms in a psychopathology of empire. It was evident in subplots, but it was rarely on central stage. Little Emily hiked off to Australia in David Copperfield, or Mary and Jem writing home from Canada at the end of Mary Barton, an extraterritorial future projected into the future, into the distance. Said points out that references to empire in 19th century novels are aplenty, but always at the margins, just about out of sight. This constant pushing to the side, a kind of inveterate relegation, intrigued me. That a wider world newly inhabited by Britons should be active in visions of domestic communities, constantly hovering in people's imagination, but always in the background, always to the side, was both perplexing and tantalizing, and it made me wonder why. And then it made me start thinking, is it really true? Is this happening? Was this sidelining something that was real, or was we just looking in the wrong place? And looking in the wrong way. So the question was all the more pertinent when one considered that emigration made colonies part of the everyday life experience of pretty much everyone living in Britain at the time. In the 19th century, everyone knew someone who had or had considered emigrating, even if they hadn't chosen emigration for themselves. They would have read about their experiences or seen posters and advertisements for shipping passages abroad, lands for sale, or for items to take with them, medicines perhaps. If migration was not a theme central to novels, it certainly was there, all too present in the ambient print culture of the time. In fact, when I started looking in texts other than the novel, in magazines and newspapers, and then other kinds of books, I confronted a vast body of writing and images, utterly saturated with accounts of migration. That emigration is everywhere in 19th century print began to present an answer to what was threatening to become something like a Where's Wally quest regarding the novel. If I thought about the novel not as a separate thing, but as a subset of a much wider body of printed text in which migration dominated, new solutions started to become visible to me. So two striking images stayed in my mind when I was writing the book, and one is very familiar, and that is Ford Maddock Brown's Last of England, the painting from 1855. It depicts a couple, or a family actually, because there's a little baby inside the shawl, a family emigrating to Australia. And among all the fascinating details in this widely circulating image of emigration, among which there are all sorts of things that are interesting. So we can talk about the image, if you like, later on. But the thing that really drew my attention was in the second, the inset image there, the detail that underneath the clothes of the emigrants is a pile of books. Casually lying amongst their possessions, and it made me wonder why were books there? Why weren't they wrapped up, for instance? What are they doing? Why is there a pile of books? Seems very significant. The second image comes from a book by the travel writer Emma Roberts, and it's a long quotation actually. This is from a book called Scenes and Characteristics of Hindustan. If you've read the introduction, you'll know that I use this quotation. I love this quotation, this passage from their book. On her passage to India, she notes that the beach at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa is said sometimes to be literally strewed with novels. I won't go on, but it's really fascinating image of books as a kind of detritus that's just there in this bizarre position on the coast of Africa when she's on her way to India, which is much further, as we know. The passage is intriguing, not just for the image of all those bad novels from Paternoster Row, then the centre of London's publishing trade, washed up like seaweed on the African shore, and in India too, papering over the city, upside down as decorative objects in an environment in which English is not evenly read. But it's also striking for its emphasis on movement. These books are literally on the move, in the throes of transportation, in a ship, a palanquin, a hawker's cart, for instance, and their dynamism and what feels like their modernity seems to be related to this. So why did literature and movement seem to be so deeply entangled at this moment? I think, and I argue in the book, that the common denominator is print. The 1820s and 1830s were a dynamic phase in the history of print that spurred far-reaching changes in social and cultural life. New technologies such as steam-powered printing, machine-made paper and stereotype plates combined to make printing cheaper, faster and more plentiful than ever in the past. Print took new forms, small, less prestigious octavo volumes that slipped easily into the pocket for taking on a journey, new, cheaper kinds of bindings in cloth and paper, and publication of works in parts on single sheets and without wrappers, all designed for new readerships, including among them lower social classes, subaltern readers too, hungry for knowledge and entertainment. And these changes were evident not just in Britain. Printed texts in English were spreading around the world. The year before Robert published her book, Thomas Carlyle wrote similarly about printed texts in a slightly more dignified way, I think, in Sartor Rosatus in 1833. English print, or movable type, as he refers to it, had permeated the entire world, he claims. Even in Timbuktu, he says, we are not safe from British literature, a little joke from Carlyle. His anxious perceptions of the global spread of print reflect a world in which print and human movement are closely aligned, for it was the vast corpus of printed text made possible by these new print technologies that stimulated, documented, and bureaucratically organized movement. So as well as being a social and a demographic practice, therefore, human migration in this period was a print phenomenon. These are palanquins, so we should have had that before, but here's some emigration literature. Print whetted people's curiosity about emigration and provided the means, the motives, and the informational framework in which their journeys took place. Print was a technology of transport quite as powerful as steam itself. So human migration, I argue in the book, takes place in a maelstrom of print: passports, licenses, forms to be filled out by passengers and agents, charts, tables, letters, surveys. Emigrants entered into a world of officialdom that regulated their passage between continents. I think this is what Dickens is getting at in Bleak House with Caddy Jellyby and her writing. So those of you who know Bleak House will realise what I'm talking about here. Administration and information were key elements of 19th century emigration, made and conveyed in print. Information gathered by government and company agents was printed in pamphlets that advised and encouraged potential emigrants how to travel, where to go, shipping routes and timetables, what to take on the journey, how many victuals to be supplied during the crossing, blah, blah, blah. So everything is printed, and often printed in tabular form. And that's something that really grasped my imagination as well. These pamphlets spawned more pamphlets. They borrowed freely from each other, often presenting their data, as I say, in tabular form. They impressed on recycled and superseded information, the look of precise and useful current facts. This is a self-authorizing body of works that turns the geography of migration into an ephemeral and highly textual landscape. In the midst of relentless cross-referencing and cross-quoting, new colonies acquire the eerie effects of a confabulation of print. But emigration guides were just one part of a literature of emigration that also contained, for instance, government policy documents, digests of parliamentary debates, works on the topography and natural history of settlements, the ethnography of native peoples, and which were written about in newspapers and magazines too. Print was portable, and it accompanied people on their journeys, helping to fill the empty days of long distance travel. On board ship, people not only read, but they supplemented their reading matter by producing their own. Newspapers written by passengers turned the trivia of shipboard life into news, as though a ship were a parish or a province. And once settled abroad, emigrants continued to read. New colonies were important markets for English print. Perhaps not in Timbuktu, as Carlyle has it, but certainly in New York, Melbourne, Bombay, and Cape Town, sister houses of London publishers flourished, creating patterns of publication that were syncopated across continents. These are all, there you go. Okay, so these are books that are kind of interesting because they're published in London, but also in India as well, mostly in India as well. That dual publication is something that I started to become interested in. At every stage of a migrant's journey, there was print. Print produced a continuity of experience, as though it papered over the differences of distance. As one of the period's most popular and lucrative forms of print, fictional works then were firmly embedded in this wider print culture, which is my literature of migration. All kinds of fiction participated in the print networks that extended across the globe, serving important new markets. So when George Eliot's widower, John Cross, wrote in 1885, he computed the size of Eliot's readership to be vastly expanded by the addition of colonial markets, the largest of all being in America, actually, in the US. The English-speaking races, as he puts it in the racist terminology of his time, They have increased from 30 million in 1820 to 100 million in 1884. In book marketing terms alone, this accounts for literary flourishing on a massive and global scale. Despite this, Cross consistently pictured Eliot quietly conversing with neighbours in an English country village, rather than the sprawling population that her work in fact addressed. The coziness that he projects onto this dispersed readership misrepresents the diverse people and ways of life that distinguish the reality of colonial experience, not to mention the forms of violence and control active within them. But his writing repeats the way in which Victorians often imagined the wider world and their place within it as inhabitants of a village community extended across continents, a view that novels seem powerfully to endorse. So surveying the relationship between print and migration made me realise the extent to which fiction is embedded in the practices of colonisation in this period. There are a good many studies of British literature's relationship to empire. In most, fiction figures principally as a representational site for the articulation of certain political or ethical responses to empire, standing apart from the material and social circumstances that they critique. As text in which mobility is encoded, I agree with this, but if we also think about the material ways in which novels are embedded in these migratory scenes, participants in the very dynamics of moving, a new way of realizing their significance within the colonial project began to become legible to me. As portable commodities tied to the movement of people, fictions are involved in the processes of colonization, not only through the stories they tell, but also through their material form. As part of the paraphernalia of mobile population, novels actively participated in the reshaping of local cultures around the world in many different ways. So considered in the context of migration, particular elements within fictions, both formal and thematic, come to the fore. In particular, I think it helps to explain the preference in the 19th century novel for figures of metonymy over metaphor. Texts in the literature of migration tend to foreground physical closeness and relationships of contiguity and adjacency. Typically, they activate tropes based on the idea of displacement, that is, the cathexis that occurs when an emotional charge passes from one idea or thought to another. One effect of this is to identify points of contact or proximity within texts as sites of psychic investment and affective payoff, whether this be the pleasure or pain or anxiety, triumphalism or guilt. This is evident, for instance, in discussions of the organisation of shipboard accommodation, in accounts of the roads and canals which tie places together, in the constantly posed problem of how to maintain closeness with relatives and friends on the other side of the world, and the equally difficult issue of how a ruling class might establish lines of control over populations when they are geographically dispersed. So whether the issue is the threat of contamination, a failure of communication, or suppression of subaltern rebellion, writings on migration constantly dwell on the overdetermined dynamics of contiguous relations. So this emphasis on contiguity seeps through all the literature of migration, exerting its logic everywhere, I think, from informational pamphlets, bureaucratic documents, magazines, short stories, to the great Victorian novels. All are shaped according to this principle of adjacency. It operates in their thematic agenda, their aesthetic choices, and even their physical layout. Contiguity in these texts defines what Rancière refers to as the distribution of the sensible, designating what can and what can't be seen or felt, and what lies in some hazy middle zone. It educates the body and the mind and habituates modes of response. Timetables, newspaper columns, and serialized novels in magazines all trained people to read a page like a mapped terrain, following a route downwards or across a page, gazing sometimes to the side as though from a carriage window, cognizant of what is on the road or railway side in the near distance and lying ahead. Or there's a map of the world. That's from one of the emigration pamphlets. I can talk a little bit more about that as well. because I think it's kind of an interesting map. Proximity to the body defined regions of sensorial contiguity, yet print changed the scale, projecting areas of contact across the surface of the globe. Just as travel altered the rhythms of everyday life and changed patterns of attention, so too did reading, and it did so along these lines of contiguous connection. So the accent on contiguous connection defines the spatial imaginary of the literature of migration. Critics have long noted that the elaborate images of webs, tissues and nets in Middlemarch or networks in Bleak House demonstrate a geographical imagination fixated on lines of contiguous relation. Seen within the culture of migration, these tropic priorities have a new resonance. The lines of association suggest new kinds of mapping, sketchings of routes and territories, a reordering of the world for travellers. In fiction, as in migrants' journeys, points of contact where bodies meet and connections are made are invested with intense feelings or comfort or fear. Often the driving force of a novel's plot is the revelation of interconnectedness between disparate people. This is not just in the marriages that provide narrative denouements, but at every step of the way. Kinship, commerce, and empire present overlapping grids, each with their own lines of connection and contact, which interlace and organize the world of the novel. So contiguity shapes the moral compass of novels and their effective regimes. Intimacy is dangerous, yet being too far away equally poses threats and challenges, so that strategies for registering, rendering, and managing distance come to the fore. There is a heightened concern in these texts with scale, with levels of attention and distraction. In Walter Scott's influential mode of long-distance fiction, where the crucial events of the plots which occur in the past in India are presented under the shroud of boredom, or with loudness and silence, intelligible and unintelligible speech, and so on. I have examples from other chapters which you haven't read, so I'll skip that. The literature of migration, I argue, produces a poetics of calibration, and that's something that I became quite interested in. The emphasis on contiguity also figures materially in the relationship between fictional texts and the wider literature of migration, as print commodities nestles beside other texts about moving. The proximity between texts enables a flow of ideas and images between genres and media, so that motifs, phrases, and words, even wholesale passages and pieces of information, bleed from one text to another, adapted and distorted in the process. The expanded print culture of the period produces fictional forms that are especially porous, receptive to influences from sources that surround and encroach on them. We might think of print as a zone in which distinct genres make contact and attempt to make sense of each other, just as in context of human cultural contact, theorized some years ago by Mary Louise Pratt as contact zones. We see in print acts of translation and mistranslation, mimicry and appropriation, negotiation and diffusion. The crossing between genres might even recall the fraught dynamics of the border, where regimes of law and lawlessness superimpose on each other, creating the condition for reinvention and disguise. A highly charged performative arena, print operates as a space of dialectical engagement in which distinct genres and media represent themselves within the terms of other formats. There are many other examples of this, these subtle forms of insinuation. Print provides the means through which texts about migration infiltrate fictional texts, not just as a plot line or a motif, but as a shaping force that influences styles of writing and also defines its central concepts. This infiltration is a two-way process. In the same way that literary texts are shaped from the inside by migration, writings on migration are informed and molded by literary texts. So I examined some of the ways in which influential ideas about emigration and colonization of the day were formulated in what seems to be a fictional form, a form that they've learned from literary texts. Okay. When John Cross imagined George Eliot addressing her readers as though they were a village community, he was motivating the spatial economy of migration. Against the backdrop of the excessively stretched out transcontinental population made possible by the new infrastructure of transport and communication, he imagined little groups of close-knit readers. Here's one. Huddled around a family hearth or on a deck, like here. Cross's vision is a fantasy that purposefully concealed the wider context of colonialism, the local economies and customs that they deliberately and often violently uprooted. But it was a fantasy shared by many. Indeed, he was writing at a time when politicians and writers saw the settlement of Britons in colonies across the world, some of which had now been inhabited by several generations, as a central plank in Britain's increasing global dominance. This new, specifically Anglo-centric way of thinking about the world, sometimes referred to as the ideology of Greater Britain, drew energy from the buoyancy of a global market in printed commodities. And that's the subject of chapter 7, which you may have read also, the Daniel Deronda chapter. And it's the area, I use this as the kind of the end point of my thinking. I think it's the end of a phase, and it's. I think I produce a different reading of Daniel Deronda. Most people think of it, or it's usually written about as a novel that's a particularly kind of interesting novel about Jewish migration or Jewish settlerism. What people haven't really thought about is that there's a very strong critique of Anglo-settler colonialism in the novel as well, and that I think that that's in dialogue with the kind of proto-Zionism in the novel as well. It seems to me that's kind of important. So I've just got a tiny bit more. When I began work on the book, I thought it was going to be a book about mobility, and I think it is. So that's what I used to say I was writing about. I'm writing about mobility, I'd say. I drew on work in mobility studies and on space theory, but I hadn't been prepared for the ways in which mobility as such would be embedded in colonial ideologies and practices. For the point that struck me most powerfully over the course of writing the book is how very important is the presumption of 19th century British colonists that voluntary moving is the sole prerogative of the colonizer. We see recurrent evidence of this in 19th century texts, where it's often underwritten by stories of invasion and conquest from Britain's medieval past. The right to move and the power that is accrued from moving are both on the side of the colonizer, making colonized people, natives or indigenes, earlier generations of colonial settlers, static and immobile. It has become a familiar gesture to characterize colonized others as people who are static and a common encoding of primitive indigeneity. But native peoples and indigenous cultures are just as mobile as the next, perhaps more so even. And the principal justifications behind European colonization in America and Australia rested on perceived nomadism among indigenous people who had no Western concept of property. So there's a deeper contradiction here, I think, around these questions of mobility in relation to colonization, and all attempts to resolve them are ideologically driven. And it's for that reason that I chose the image for the cover from an Inuit sculptor, Joe Talirunili. The sculpture's called The Migration, not just because it's, I think it's really beautiful, but because I think it's a reminder of the way in which the colonial past redistributed ideas about right to travel in highly significant and long-lasting ways. So I'm going to cut this bit and move on and say that neither had I been expecting to see how much discourses of migration in the 19th century are haunted by African slavery. And that, I mean, now it seems completely obvious, but at the time when I was working on it, it really wasn't obvious. And this came out for me most explicitly in Edward Wakefield's Letter from Sydney, which is a key text of kind of colonial settlerism in the 1840s. It's very influential. written amidst the debates about abolition. The context is abolition, I think. Ostensibly a diatribe against penal transportation, a form of migration that in fact persisted for several more decades. The work is also one which seeks fundamentally to distance colonial emigration from slavery. But at every turn, it raises the suspicion that perhaps they're not so different after all. It's a classic example, I think, of what Lowe refers to as a, quote, narrative of freedom overcoming enslavement, that at once denies colonial slavery, erases the seizure of lands from native people, displaces migrations and connections across continents, and internalizes these processes as a national struggle of history and consciousness. Migration in this period always takes place under the sign of freedom, but a fragile liberty, always scarred by its own contradictions. Thus, migration narratives explore ideas of capture and captivity and the ways in which transport, which on the one hand give people freedom, also imprisons them. So I ended the book, as you might have seen, if you got that far, with a short discussion of Conrad's short story, Amy Foster, a famous story from 1901 about a Polish man who is washed up on the shore of Kent, the sole survivor of a shipwrecked emigration ship en route to America. The man's tragedy is to end up in Kent. English people might laugh at that point, actually, but anyway, facing the shocking inhospitality of the local English people. There's something very persistent about Kent, and well, at the moment, Kent is in the news. Kent is the seat of Brexit, actually, but it's also the place where migrants are coming from Calais on their little boats all the time. So it's a coast with a real history of inhospitality written into it. Many of the tropes in Amy Foster are the same as the ones that I find in the earlier periods, in my earlier texts, but there are differences. And one of them is the hyper-racialized context in which Conrad places this, this story, evident most clearly in the surrounding articles in the illustrated London News. I mean, it's a very kind of imperial moment, and there are lots of incredibly kind of what we just consider racist images of Africans, for instance, and lots of advertisements for colonial commodities that also really kind of infuse the context. Another thing that I think is different is the radical alterity of the foreigner that Conrad expresses, for whom the English, now it's the English indigenes can't accommodate him. For Edward Said, this story is the most uncompromising representation of exile ever written. More recently, Lindsay Stonebridge and Jacqueline Rose read it as in the context of post-war refugees and even the current migration crisis. But how I think that story relates to our current predicament is a much more complicated story than that, the beginning of which I think my book is an attempt to negotiate. Okay, I hope that wasn't too long. I have been teaching all afternoon. I didn't think I could ad lib about anything because my brain has gone a bit tired, but I'm going to turn this off now. Beep. Stop.
Thank you so much, Jo. That's a wonderful introduction and very comprehensive to orient all of us. And thank you for giving that talk right after a whole afternoon of teaching as well. So thank you so much. We now have plenty of time for questions. So I invite people to ask questions either by just unmuting yourself and talking. I think we're a small enough group to negotiate that easily, or if you prefer to put your question into the chat, I can read it out and we can do it that way.
I can.
Yeah.
Sorry, Susan, go ahead.
No, please, Padman, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for that talk. It was the image of movable type is just fabulous and so rich, and it sent my mind spinning in many directions. I was reminded of a scene towards the end of Confessions of a Justified Sinner when Robert Ringham, as he's moving towards the borders, stops and tries to print his pamphlet, and then the devil shows up, and there's that amazing scene where the paper is flying everywhere before he abandons that project and then moves towards the borders. So it's just, the scope of it is fantastic. And I have to apologize, I didn't have time to read more than a few pages of the excerpt that you sent us. So if this question is something that's answered in the pages that you sent us, I apologize, but I was very curious about the dates of the project, 1815, 1876, particularly because, I mean, the things that popped into my head is that this is post-Waverley, but 1876 to me was such an unusual and interesting date because, particularly in your talk, when you were talking about the importance of maps and this kind of abundance of print culture, the first place my mind went was to those later Victorian adventure novels and Haggard, and with the map facsimiles actually printed in, inserted into the book, and this just sort of abundance of media. And it seemed to me sort of wonderful that you decided to eschew that the adventure novel phase of novel history and end it before what seems like, the place that it might actually go. So I was curious about this particular time period, which again, for me, and especially where we get towards the middle of it, is always associated with some of the more boring bureaucratic parts of imperial conquest before they try to jazz it up again, later on.
That's a good question. So the beginning date is easier to answer to than the end date, actually. But the beginning date is it's 1815, I think, because it's post Waterloo, and that is a date of historical significance, actually, not just because it's the date when I mean, it's a kind of interesting coincidence that that's actually the moment of Scott's as a fiction writer as well, and the moment of Mansfield Park too, but it's post Waterloo that emigration starts to become a national project for dealing with the social problems that post-war Britain is facing. And so there are lots of schemes that start, well, the schemes themselves start a few years later, actually. They don't really get going until a bit later, but it starts becoming a subject of national conversation in print and in Parliament, that this is a good way of dealing with the problems, that we have all these veterans coming home. One of the first people that writes about this is Patrick Colquhoun, who was who I think is a really fascinating figure, who some of you might have worked on. I don't know if he means anything to you, but he's the guy that he began the police, the river police.
Yeah. He writes that treatise on policing.
Yeah. But before that, he'd been a West India man, actually. Oh no, actually in Virginia, in America. So he'd worked in plantations and kind of been a manager of plantations. And it was after the war in America that he came back to Britain and kind of reinvented himself as a law and order man. And that's, for me, it seems really interesting kind of connection there. But he writes this a work in 1814, I can't remember what it's called now, but a large treatise, and in it he says, oh, we've got to start sending veterans to the West Indies, because we need them, in that we need security after because it's the end of the slave trade. So there are no new slaves coming in. So there's a labour shortage but there's also a security problem, because enslaved people are getting a bit uppity now, and we might well be having rebellions on our hands. So that that when he poses the project of emigration is precisely into that post-war moment, which is also a post-slave slave trade moment as well. So I think that's for me seemed an incredibly kind of important moment. So that's why I start at that time. But it's also the time when I started off the project. The very first thing I did on it was about Guy Mannering, actually, the Scott novel that's about a gypsy. And I realized that it has this kind of Indian backstory. So some of the novel takes place in India, but actually not in the real time of the novel. So, and curiously, it's actually Katie Trumpner writes about this already. And but that Mansfield Park, similarly, a novel with a kind of a distant distant backstory on which everything depends in the present of the novel. So it seemed kind of really a rich moment of dispersal, I suppose, but in a very kind of interestingly regulated way. So that's and new kinds of fiction being written there. So that's why I started in 1815. I give these very precise dates in my titles, and then I forget what they are. So start giving the wrong dates for my own titles. However, 1815, I have it here to check, because it could have been 1814, sort of. Dates are kind of, stakeholders anyway. But the end date, actually 1876, is really because it's the date of Daniel Deronda was published. But it seemed to me that was a way of kind of flagging a new phase of imperialism, where I think things are changing, really. I see Daniel Deronda as being very much a kind of transitional type of novel. And I mean, I'm not alone in that. Everyone says that about it. But I think that one can track its transitionalness through the way in which it's using this trope of settlerism and settler migration. So that's why I said 1876. Originally, confession time, when I started the project and started sketching it out, I just thought, oh, probably Hardy should be in it. But I just thought, I mean, I love Hardy, but it's just too much. And I thought, I've got to invent a project that's an end point that will not allow me to write about Hardy. So that was kind of why I did it. Anyway.
Well, I'm sorry we didn't get to read the Hardy, but maybe that's in the future.
I didn't write the Hardy. Someone else can write it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, oh, Heidi, please.
Sorry, actually, I see Jonathan's hand. Okay, so I thank you so much for that talk and for your for circulating your work. So I should preface this by saying I'm coming at this as a French studies scholar. So Waterloo, I guess I'm on the other side of that one, although I have no allegiance to Napoleon at all. But I was struck by of course many similarities going on in sort of 19th century print cultures, the ones that you're discussing, particularly, and I know this because I've been buried in 19th century newspapers now, that so much of sort of emigration narratives are playing out in other parts of the newspaper. And meanwhile, that many novels, not all of them in the French 19th century sort of tradition, are sort of about France, right? And less about, the French colonies and things. So there's sort of some similarities, although there are some sort of glaring exceptions to that in the French literary canon. But what was sort of occurring to me was that, at least in French literature, you have a lot of more sort of emigration stories occurring in the 18th century literary texts than you do sort of even, you do have them in the Romantic period. So up sort of through the 1820s and 30s. And then it becomes sort of centralized and focused on France. And so I just wondered whether that, to sort of tag on to Padma's question, whether that was also maybe occurring in England, where you have this kind of overt engagement with emigration in an earlier period, perhaps. And then what then do you make of the fact that, if that is the case, that there is this sort of internalization that you're pushing back against, right? What you're arguing is that these so-called internalized narratives in the 19th century in England are actually really all about migration and immigration. So I don't know, that's not a great question, but I just was sort of struck by the sort of French comparison, and then also the temporality question. You know, were these immigration narratives present in other periods and outside of the ones that you're looking at?
Yeah, no, that is a really interesting point and a really interesting question. I suppose the one thing that I would say that I don't know about this, but I'm going to say that I don't think that the French state is involved in emigration schemes in quite the same way that Britain is. So one of the things that struck that I mean, the sources that I was thinking with were largely apart from the fictional sources, but within a massive print culture that was about the organization, on large scale organization of settler migration. And I'm not sure, but I don't know whether that was such a important element of French print culture in the 19th century, but I might be wrong about that. But that might account for some of the differences. And as for the there's I suppose there are narratives of migration in the 18th century. In fact, actually, Charlotte Sussman's book that came out earlier this year, or maybe last year, called Peopling the World, is a kind of very brilliant account of the way in which migration narratives are taken up after Milton, and she talks a lot about how influential those last lines of Paradise Lost are, that the world was all before us and we went to populate the world. So yeah, people are thinking about migration, people are definitely moving, and people are writing about moving. But the thing that I think is distinctive about the period that I'm writing about is this kind of large-scale national discussion of organized movement. So that's what I think, and I think it's quite specific. And I do think it changes in the after Daniel Deronda at the end of the 19th century as well. It becomes, I think it becomes much more jingoistic and all those sorts of things, but they're kind of obvious things to say, really. But I think in a way that it isn't in quite the same way in the earlier phase that I became interested in. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but it is a really interesting one. Be interesting to think about German literature too, actually, I suppose.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think, when you're talking about, a scheme, right, immigration schemes, I think you're absolutely right. Some sort of top-down organized, bureaucratic movement maybe is not so much a thing in France. I mean, they were still just all about, going and colonizing, and less about,
The other thing that happens in Britain alongside this kind of state interest are these commercial companies, colonization companies, and that's a real feature of British emigration. So joint stock companies that are set up, and this is something that's been happening earlier on in the 18th century as well, but it becomes a real feature of colonization in the 19th century as well, and tied into a phase of globalization that I think is probably quite specifically British, but I don't know. Actually, my husband's a French historian, so I'm going to go home and ask him.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Jonathan, hop in, please.
Susan, do you have to go to teach? Are we supposed to end at 4:30?
No, that was from Walter.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, and we have until 5, so we have plenty of time.
Oh, I see. I understand. Okay, great. Well, I have one very small comment. Weren't the French eagerly getting people to move to Algeria? Wasn't that part of the French states? But the questions are a little different. I just was thinking about that because it came up. But I was wondering, I really, really enjoyed listening to you talk, Joe. It's really fabulous. And I wanted to sort of see if you could talk more about the idea of print as a contact zone, because I think you had sort of one paragraph on it, and it just kind of, it really was evocative and helpful for me, but I wondered if you could say a bit more kind of along those lines. And a question that's related but sort of different, and is I was also wondering, thinking of print as a contact zone seems to go along with a lot of the literature on travelers. And I wondered how you kind of decide, how you sort of parsed out travel, or how to think about the difference between travel literature and migration literature.
That's a really good point, actually. Yes. So I suppose the thing so just to talk about this in terms of how I came to think about print as a contact zone, it's partly because I got interested in emigration pamphlets, that I realized that there was this whole kind of sub-literary literary genre that was just telling people how to, they're like how-to books, and I started to become fascinated with them, and realized that they're incredibly repetitive, and they repeat each other and they quote each other, and they are the most kind of self-referential body of work. So I started thinking like how it's, and people were reading them to know where they're going, but actually, like, what are they going to know from it? They're going to know what they've, they're just going to have this kind of confabulation of different things that are circulating in the print. And then I realized that actually there's a whole, the production of these emigration pamphlets was closely related to new legislation around shipboard travel. And so that there were new laws put in place to regulate. So there's an enthusiast who's in the government who's actually related to Byron, who's Byron's first cousin. So it's a literary note for us, but it's called Horton, something Horton. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. I can't remember his name, but it will come back to me. Robert something Horton. And so he brings in, he's very enthusiastic about an early form of settler colonization, getting people out to Canada, to South Africa first off, and that was complete failure, and then to Canada. But he realizes that you have to start legislating about how many people that you can get on a ship, for instance, so that they don't all die on board. And so there are very stringent rules about the space that people, the number of immigrants that you could, the number of people's births on an emigrant ship. Quite some emigrant ships had been slave ships too, actually, so kind of repurposing that was also kind of interesting. But then also there's a whole thing about information, and so he sets up and legislates for a system of agents. So there are agents, government agents in these new in new ports, and that they send information. So there's a whole kind of great infrastructure of knowledge that's circulating around, telling people, giving people information really about what to expect when they get to this place. But in the nature of information, there's a kind of great deal of fantasy and misinformation involved in it as well. So that was where those ideas started coming to me. And then I realized that actually print in this period, there's so much print, and it's so portable, and it's so much a kind of a traveling thing, and it's so invested in migration and the new markets really for print that are growing up in these new settlements, that that it started to become, in my mind, firstly an agent of transportation. It's the kind of the means by which people can move, but also that in itself a zone in which everything is getting really mixed up in kind of curious sorts of ways. And I suppose it's that's how the idea came for me. And then just thinking about periodicals, for instance, and the form of the periodical, and the fact that many novels are serially produced amongst this kind of within the context of this very miscellaneous kind of print form. That's so that's sort of where the idea was coming from, and it becomes a good way of thinking about the I suppose what Bakhtin would talk about as kind of dialogism within the novel, the many different voices, the many different languages that are kind of assembled together. Does that answer the question? There was another part to the question, but I can't remember what it was now.
That's great, and I'm gonna cite that. It's gonna be. I'm using this print context, and I love it. I'm gonna use it in my own work, and I'm definitely gonna cite you. It's terrific. But the other question was just about. I was sort of thinking about how you think about the difference between migration and travel, but you don't need to answer it. I give the space to others. Other stuff.
Well, I suppose the thing about migration is that well. So when I started writing the book, there was when I worked in Oxford actually, and in my college, my friend in college was a migration studies guy, a political theorist called Matthew Gibney, and he took me aside one day and explained to me about how people conceptualize migration, and he told me about the phases of migration, the kind of the leaving, the push-pull factors, the leaving, the journey, and the arrival. And so that was a kind of one of those light bulb moments, and I sort of thought, oh, I can sort of see how one can organize all of this. But of course, one of the consequences of that is that migration tends to be thought about as an end, as a kind of teleology, that it ends, and that most people, when they think about arrival, the questions are ones about integration actually. And in fact, actually, I've noticed that since I've been working in the US, and I've taught quite a few courses on literature and migration, and that American narratives of migration they tend to be about integration actually, and arrival and integration, and whether or not people can integrate or not, and the formation of kind of subgroups within a wider culture. And it's very specific. It's very interesting actually, because I think in Europe migration is actually about people leaving, or then people coming in and invading. So it's quite a different thing. But so I think that that's really different from travel narratives. So travel narratives, I think, tend to be generated by a kind of consumerism, actually. So it's a kind of an aesthetics of pleasure of travel, and traveling as a tourist, as somebody, as a person that's kind of consume the scenes that they're going to see. I don't think that's the same in migration narratives. I think that the phases of migration narratives are different, and I also think that I don't think that people stay in the same place. I mean, I think that's just not the case, and that people arrive and then move almost immediately, or go back home, or so the journeys are much more frenetic than that three-part formation suggests. But nevertheless, there are issues around settlement that I think are really important, which are part of the migrant narrative, and that they're not within the travel narrative, I think, or kind of tour narrative in the same way at all. And I think the point of view of the traveller is a really different one as well. But then again, there are also loads of overlaps as well. So yeah, yeah.
I kind of want to ask about your terms, just sort of originally, and then also growing out of your comments now in the Q&A. I'm fascinated by the turn that you started off with mobility and ended with migration, because I'm familiar with the mobility thesis from geography, you know, which is sort of just like, as modernity continues, people become more and more mobile. I feel like that connects a bit to what you were just saying about the consumerism associated with travel. I feel like maybe is part of the mobility paradigm, but I also feel like mobility speaks to a kind of individual, personal, physical kind of experience, you know, related to ability and disability. And it has something to do, in a way, perhaps with a term that doesn't appear in the book, which is romanticism, you know? So I feel like you did really, you know, I'm curious about that. The romanticism has nothing to do with, you know, what you're talking about. And I understand perhaps why you're interested in novels and, as you said, like post-Waterloo and all the rest. But I was wondering if you could maybe, I don't know, what your thoughts are about the term mobility. And then also, for me, there was a little bit of a cognitive twitch when I realized that migration meant emigration, right? Like a kind of British diaspora, and not immigration as well, that was not part of the story. I mean, obviously the book could have run to like many volumes if you wanted to talk about all that. But migration, the poetics of that term, and maybe it's just to an American ear, like it has a kind of species connotation to it, you know, like it sounds like birds, basically. You know, and I was just wondering, is that like actually a difference, or like actually, you know, the book is just about migration as British people leaving the British Isles, and that's, you know, straightforward.
So the loads of things there. So the first thing, I'll talk about the species, actually, because that chimes with a novel I don't really write about in the book, but in Jane Eyre. I think that the beginning of Jane Eyre, that she's the Bewick's birds. Do you remember, in the Red Room and the Bewick's birds? And that is what's really curious about it is that it's called, I think it's called British birds, but in fact all the birds that are represented are birds that migrate really long distances. So I think that the kind of the connotations of the species, I think, are kind of embedded somehow in the notions of migration that are being discussed within these texts. Romanticism. So I don't use the term romanticism, but it's not that I don't think romanticism is important or it doesn't exist. I think could have started the book earlier, because in fact that there's quite a lot of really interesting stuff that's written by Wordsworth and Southey, for instance, on they had very strong opinions about migration. And in fact, Horton, I wish I could remember his full name, but it will come back to me, Robert something Horton, the guy, the Byron person. So he's a sort of romantic, actually, and his view of migration is to, and it doesn't really last, but he just wants people to go to Canada and have their own little plot of land and become smallholders and live in some sort of you know, kind of Wordsworthian sort of communion with nature, and in a sort of way, it's slightly mediated, but that's sort of what's happening. But actually, when when things take off, when Wakefield publishes his work about systematic colonization, it's completely different. And this notion of individual small holdings just doesn't work at all. And what Wakefield is interested in is how do you get a bunch of workers out to Australia to work the land, because they've got all these people that are emigrating to Australia, all this allegedly free space or land, and that you can own whatever you like, but there's no one to work the land. You haven't got, so there's no labouring class there. So in fact, that what he does, which becomes incredibly influential, is invents a whole new way of thinking about the transportation of working class people. I mean, he's mostly interested in men, but it's easy for someone like Chisholm to turn it into working class families. But it's about them not being landowners, but being employed, and they are sort of contracted. What's the term? I'm sorry, it's been a long day, and my word.
Indentured, maybe.
Indentured. They're sort of indentured, actually, and that's the kind of systematic colonization that's introduced at that point. And so in a way, I think that the romantic vision is there within an early phase of emigration policy, but it isn't practical for the needs of the kind of empire, the empire's economy, and that shifts things quite a lot. So then, now, what was the rest of the question? The difficult parts that I'm avoiding.
Oh, I was asking about mobility, and as like personal mobility and disability.
Okay.
Well, I think it's just an observation that, like, in the process of writing the project, you moved from mobility to migration. And what you just said about romanticism suggests to me that, it's not about like an individual's solitary flight to,
No. It's a social vision that is embedded in all of this, and that's what's so significant about it. I think it's not about, I mean, even though that there is I think there are two things going on. On the one hand, that there's a very strong narrative about freedom, so it's a kind of liberal narrative about individual freedoms, and about freedom is being expressed in the ability to move wherever you want to move to. But on the other side of that, which is the other side of the coin, is that it's very much a social vision about organizing and kind of inventing and planting new communities in different parts of the world. So I think that I do focus on that because I think it's so important. I don't write that much about immigration into Britain because actually I'm going to say there isn't much of it happening. There isn't that much of it happening until there's a big phase of it after at the end of the century, so Eastern European immigration, where it becomes a different kind of a story. Obviously there is immigration earlier on, but it's on a different scale. Actually, if I were being very critical of myself, so I'm going to now become one of you and say what I think is really missing in the book is I don't really talk about Ireland, actually, and that's sort of with my Irish heritage, I feel that I should have really thought about that more. And I did do quite a bit of work about Irish emigration, but it never stuck somehow. I don't quite know why. I think it seemed to not be part of the spine of the story that I was telling. But it would be interesting to think about how that story would change if I did think more seriously about emigration, about Ireland in relation to Britain, or in the rest of the world, actually.
Certainly. Okay. Are there more questions?
I have just a follow, hopefully, short question about class and gender and what seem to be sort of opposing narratives in that way. Because, you know, as you pointed out, there was this need for working class men primarily, right? And of course, you have all the clearances happening, which provides, you know, groups of working class people who either need to become soldiers or, and, you know, whatnot, or laborers elsewhere. But what's interesting to me is the not exactly counter narrative, but vague counter narrative of the types of women who my understanding is they want to emigrate, right? Because of the sort of late 18th century phenomenon that you read about a lot is women going to India or whatever as brides.
Yeah.
And then of course, later on in the 19th century, I remember I taught this pamphlet before, which I think is literally called like the problem of surplus women, right? And the solution is you need to export women because otherwise their class standing in England becomes precarious and they'll become prostitutes because they're, you know, you can only have, there's a sort of finite number of governesses that can run around. And so you have the sort of Jane Eyre conundrum. And so there's this, you know, need to export a certain class of women in order for them to maintain a kind of class standing and not, you know, descend. So I'm curious about whether in the book, you know, how gender and class end up sort of interacting with each other or not.
Yeah. No. So. Oh, can you hear me? I'm not muted. No. Okay. So yes, and then it's not just for women to retain their class position. I mean, there's a lot of anxiety about women emigrating, particularly in the 1840s and 50s. But there's also the need for that. There's a whole thing about family emigration. So Chisholm, Caroline Chisholm, who is a philanthropist who is called the Traveller's Friend, but she's the model supposedly for Mrs. Jellyby in Bleak House, but she organised what she called family emigration to Australia, and there's the whole project behind that is to civilise these places that are barbaric because they're just full of men, so, and then there are all sorts of questions about how do you transport women to these colonies when it's so, you know, there are all these loose things going on shipboards, and they'll probably get raped anyway. So it is migration is firstly you need it for reproduction of society and reproduction of the community. But it's also it's very sexualized as well. All these discussions and debates are very sexualized. So you need to have women in the colonies, but how can you do that? Because there are so many risks. So just the precarity of female sexuality is always on the line, I think. So I think in a lot of migration discourse that's a really strong theme.
Did anyone have a last question? I think we have a few minutes left if anyone wants to jump in.
I could ask just a very tiny follow-up question about Ireland. I was interested in your referring to Ireland, and I'm just wondering if this so is the future. Are you thinking of any particular authors who could be a part of this speculative study that we've now just imposed upon you?
I think that, I mean, all those Irish writers of the novel that I mean, they write about emigration all the time because it's such a big theme. So like the Banham brothers, and there's another one whose name I can't remember now. But I did read lots of these stories and think, how could I deal with them? I wrote about one Irish writer in the chapter on Mary Russell Mitford, actually, because I mean, there are Irish people in London writing all the time anyway, and so it's a real kind of mixed up bag. But So yeah, so there's some of her friends, Mitford's friends, but you haven't read that chapter. But anyway, I got kind of fascinated by the group of people around her, because a lot of them are Irish, and that they consider their position in London through their Irishness, actually, and it's quite a precarious position, and that then the migrant narrative turns into something quite different with them. Quite funny, actually. I mean, they tend to be funny. And then the other time it comes up in the book is in actually the George Eliot, the Daniel Deronda chapter, in a marginal way, because when Maine was in India, that he was very close friends with an Irish man who was also a colonial administrator at the time. And the thing that's kind of interesting is that this person was a Celtic medievalist, medieval scholar. And so that those medieval narratives about the village that Maine is so invested in, and I think that George Eliot kind of gets hold of as well and thinks through, that those have a kind of Celtic origin, actually. So that's sort of interesting, but that isn't really the story of Irish emigration.
Yeah, thank you. I was sort of thinking along, you're answering the questions that I sort of had, you know, what perspective are we talking about these Irish authors, you know, coming from Ireland, or is it sort of these Irish authors who have already emigrated elsewhere and who are then, you know, dealing with the question and how that might inform how they would discuss and think about emigration. And the Celtic question is really interesting. I'm working right now on a 19th century photographer who's located up in Brittany, French woman photographer, and she's very invested in the sort of Celtic relationships. So Brittany and France is feeling much more sort of culturally and linguistically related to this sort of Celtic circle. So with, you know, Southern England and Wales and Ireland.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a very interesting question, and this does actually intersect in the French context with medievalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for Henry Maine, who is such an important figure in India, that he's part of this medieval Celticism as well. It's not just Celticism, but the thing about the village that he's really interested in, and that medieval German legal scholars, medievalists, are interested in a kind of ideal community, which he thinks is what you find in India, and that can be accommodated somehow within a colonial setup. So
that's really interesting. Thank you so much for this. Thank you. It's fascinating.
Thank you for your questions.
Yes, let me thank everyone who attended for being here and contributing to such a robust conversation. And please all join me in thanking you, Joe, for visiting with us and talking about your book and answering all of our questions, and also for just writing a magnificent book, which I can't wait to assign and talk about further with students and other colleagues. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm dying to hear more about logistics as well. So
always happy to talk about that. Thank you.
But thank you very much for great questions. I'm going to have a very large drink now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you next time.